What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in. I wanted to do a quick video of a recent blog post that I did this week concerning the election and your portfolio. Really encourage you to go visit the blog itself. There's some really good charts and graphs, and I think you'll get the better context of the conversation once you're able to go through and read that. So really encourage you to read it, but I thought a video would be helpful as well. So I've been really alarmed at the number of inquiries that I've received from, everyone from colleagues to friends to family to clients to some of our retirement plan participants around, what do I need to be doing with my investments around the election? And what I tried to do with the piece is to provide a context in a perspective that I think is different, very different than what has been kind of put out there, in the media and just kind of our own interpretation of things. So hope you find it helpful. But what I'd like to do today is just briefly explain my thought process in going through this. And when I wrote the piece, and this is something I've been thinking about really quite a bit over the past 6 weeks or so, I thought it'd be helpful to go through 2020. And 2020 has taught a lot of lessons from an investment standpoint that I'm hopeful that we can kind of carry forward on a going forward basis. So if you look back to December of 2019, so about a year ago, every big bank, brokerage house, wirehouse tends to put out kind of their 2020 forecast as far as what they think is going to happen in the markets for the following year. And this is not to be taken literally. So, anyone who does that, you need to find a new investment process, but it is meant to be taken with a grain of salt. And, if you look at kind of what was said as far as predicting what was going to transpire this year and some of the main talking points, and then what actually transpired in 2020, there's a huge disconnect, not surprisingly, between those two things. So you have a situation this year where I talk about, number one, you don't know that information. You don't know what the future is going to hold. But most importantly, you're never going to know what the collective psychology of the investment community is when presented with those sets of circumstances. And given the economic environment that we were dealing with in spring, there have been some areas of the investment market that have kind of defied logic. And then I talk about, I think most interestingly, a point that is referred to as upside down markets, which the team at O'Shaughnessy Research, and shout out to Jesse Livermore over there for putting out such a great piece. But it is a research paper that goes into this idea that what if bad news and bad markets actually is a good thing for investment returns over the long term, because it's more likely that the government and the Federal Reserve are going to provide an environment of stimulus that are helpful for longer term returns. So my point there was not to go into kind of the depths and the detail of that particular article, but to kind of layer in this idea that you can't draw a line from one thing happening to the markets. There's a lot of complex layers that go in there. So this idea that this is my opinion about what's going to happen in a couple of weeks, and therefore this is what I'm going to do with my portfolio, I think it's short-sighted and just not reflective of how the market actually works. So, and then we get into, once I set the table there, the election itself. I talk a little bit about this idea of known risks versus unknown risks, and how the election coming up, we've known for 4 years it's coming. It's been talked about nonstop, and it's a known, for better or for worse, whatever happens, it's a known risk. And I think a lot of the potential outcomes have been talked about already. And in my opinion, that in itself kind of takes some of the risk off the table around what could potentially happen there. Historically, the market has had trouble with the unknown risks. COVID this year is a good example. Black Monday, 1987, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, natural disasters. It's kind of those unknown things that tend to throttle the market and make it spin a little bit. And I would not categorize the upcoming election is one of those unknown risks. So, and I talk a little bit about the incumbent party and President Trump here, and the fact that I don't think you've heard a lot about what his potential policies would mean for the market because they are the incumbents. And we kind of know that we would get more or less a continuation of what has gone on over the past, over the past 4 years. So there's been much more attention to what a Biden administration would look like, which I get into in the article. But my absolutely favorite kind of talking point within there is it's a piece of data from SunTrust, and they talk about this idea that if you look back at the previous Obama administration and the Trump administration, you've had technology stocks and you've had consumer discretionary stocks be the two best asset classes from a performance perspective under both administrations. And on the other side, you've had energy and you've had financials be the worst performing sectors, also under both administrations. So I think a lot of the talk and the rhetoric, it's like apples and dump trucks, and there's just we think it's all very different, and things are going to be much different in the investment environment should a new party be in the office. But if you look historically, if that is the case, how can you explain that the exact two asset classes that performed best under the Obama administration did the same under the Trump administration? And I think the point is just trends are going to continue in the market, irrespective of who's in charge of the country in the White House. And I think, frankly, it's overrated. So I love that piece. And then I get into a little bit some of the main concerns about a Biden administration. So there's been a lot of talk about socialism, which we go through and we say, look, it's that tagline has been used going back to the 1930s when FDR passed the New Deal with Congress, talked about it during the Eisenhower years, the 1960s, as far as the interstate highway system being created and Medicare and Social Security and all these things were kind of tagged as being some form of socialism. And now we look at them as just a regular part of our society. And ironically, I make the point in there that you want to watch what people do, not what they say, right? And if you look at what has gone on, especially in a COVID world, where we're sending stimulus checks out, extending unemployment benefits, PPP loans have been given to virtually every small business that wants them, and a lot of that money is slated to be forgiven potentially. If you look at the bailouts that have taken place for corporations, presumably some of that's going to be needed for cities and towns and in states in the coming years. If you look at the farm aid that's been provided over the last 3 years due to a combination of the trade tariffs and COVID, I mean, we're running deficits bigger than the country's ever seen before, and we're in kind of a stimulus heavy environment, to say the least. So we could ironically look back, a decade or two from now and say, hey, if some of this stuff sticks from a stimulus perspective, call it UBI, call it whatever you want, but it kind of started under a Republican-led administration. So I think the fears of socialism and the Green New Deal and all this stuff is largely rhetoric and largely overblown if you look historically how it's been talked about. I also touch on the taxes, how people say taxes are going up and therefore that's a bad thing for the market. And again, there's a couple of charts in the piece that just dispute that. Going back to the 50s and 60s, where we saw some of the highest individual tax rates and some of the highest corporate tax rates, and the markets did as good or better in those environments than in any in history. And you don't have to go back that far. You can go back to 2010, 2012, which I didn't talk about in the piece, but under the Obama administration, we raised taxes a few different times, relatively substantially, and the market just kind of digested that and moved forward accordingly. So, in closing, I just feel that we have some folks from an investment standpoint have this illusion of safety that things are uncertain now, and then they're going to be okay on November 4th, irrespective of what does or does not happen. And it goes back to that analogy I used or not analogy, but September 11th. September 10th, we felt okay and thought that things were quote unquote safe. And then they just weren't the next day. So risk is going to be there from an investment standpoint, regardless of who the president is, regardless of what type of environment that looks like. And remember, it's really those unknown risks, the stuff that we're not talking about, that has proven to be what takes the market down. So even a year ago, we were talking about this election going back last December, last January as being concerning. And then some global pandemic happened that wasn't on anyone's radar, and that ended up being the catalyst to take things down in the spring. So, stay open-minded, stick with whatever plan that you have in place. And if you don't have a plan, maybe use this as a catalyst to get one. And I close with this story and a quote from Billy Beane, the famous Oakland A's executive, who, famously doesn't watch his team play ever. So this is a guy who is responsible for leading the entire organization, putting the roster together, trades, all that stuff. He's in charge of the operation, and he doesn't watch the team play. And he talks about this extensively. That he says, look, as a fan, or is the guy in charge of the team, I watch a game and I'm emotional, and it's temporary emotions, but I don't want those emotions to judge my decisions in the moment, because they're typically going to not be reflective of what I should be doing. And I thought it was a really good parallel to investing. And I think that is my big takeaway, or would be my big takeaway from this, is if I'm a political person and I'm very into, this upcoming election, regardless of what side I'm on, you need to kind of remove that from your portfolio. And irrespective of what happens, if you invest through the lens of keeping those two things separately and keeping the portfolio, instead of focused on politics, keep the portfolio focused on your risk tolerance and what those liability goals look like, what support you need from the portfolio at what point in time, and focus more on that, you're going to be better off for it. And again, be open-minded. People say it's always different the next time, so history does not repeat itself by any means, but I think it gives us kind of a good framework here of how to treat a presidential election from an investment standpoint, what to do and what not to do. And look, if there's something I'm missing here that goes completely haywire and is unexpected and the market sells off a little bit, you apply those same rules during any other market sell-off that you do during this. You rebalance the portfolio, you stay within your investment policy statement, you position yourself for a subsequent recovery, and you don't get off the tracks of kind of what your long-term objectives are going to be. Because again, the world is not going to look all that different on November 4th. A couple months from now, we're going to be talking about another risk, completely probably separate from politics. And the risk, just that is a part of investing. It doesn't go away, but you've always been rewarded historically for investing in the form of higher returns over the long term. I don't have any reason to believe that that's going to be different on a going forward basis. So I encourage you not to mix these two things up. You're investing with something like the election. It has never worked out well. I don't know why it would work out well on a going forward basis. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to discuss anything that was written, happy to do it, but I hope you find it helpful. Share far and wide if you can, because I just, from my own experience, talking to people who really are revved up a little bit about this thing, and are thinking that they should be doing something to their accounts kind of ahead of time. Hopefully they would find something like this valuable. So appreciate you taking the time to watch. And again, I would get to reading the article itself and looking at some of that, the information and the underlying sources in there were really helpful for me. So take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.